much. I'm pleased that you start your meetings this way. So maybe invite you to get comfortable, either sitting up fairly straight or standing, however it's a comfortable position for you to kind of focus on your inner experience and your body experience. And start by taking a few breaths, noticing your breath. Maybe if you're comfortable, closing your eyes or letting your gaze go soft. And just taking a few moments to just be present with your breath, noticing your in-breath, your out-breath. Letting your attention kind of spread over to the rest of your body, noticing how your body's feeling this time of day. And I invite you to kind of take a minute to appreciate your own intentions that bring you to this today. Your whatever it is, curiosity, emotional sense of something that you want to pursue or that has meaning for you. Just appreciating what brings us all here together with a common curiosity and wanting to share with each other. And also inviting you to notice how it feels to be coming together when we're not really together, and how we can still feel whatever connection we still feel, and whatever you notice about how it feels to be connected but not in the same location. And let's all take a few moments just to appreciate that we're going to be talking about research that we've done with individuals who've come forth to volunteer, and in some cases have allowed us to share video of their own very personal experiences in their healing journeys. So invite us all to just be aware of that gratitude to them and appreciate it. And I invite you to kind of keep that in mind as you're listening today. So let's go back to the breath for a few in-breaths and out-breaths and focus on our overall experience. And when you're ready, just please bring your attention back into the room in a figurative sense. So I'm going to start, my plan is to start with a PowerPoint, some PowerPoints, and kind of give you a fairly rapid overview of what we've been doing. And then we'll have the last half, second half, to Annie will join us and we'll have time for discussion. I appreciate that you've already posted some questions, and some of those I think will be addressed by what I'm going to say with the PowerPoint. But if there's something pressing that you want to stop and ask or comment on during the PowerPoint, that's fine too. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion later. So I'm really enjoying hearing your points of view too, and your thoughts and your questions. And does anybody have anything pressing that they want to say before we start? Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay, thanks. So even though I can't be there, I always like to pretend I'm out there with you, and it's really, really fun. I actually happened to be talking to David Presti yesterday, unrelated to this, and it was fun to think about talking to his class. And I must say, I did do some personal informal psychedelic research in Berkeley in the summer of 1969. So I feel some connection there. But I'm not going to talk about that part today. I'm going to talk about what we've been doing more recently. And so I want to acknowledge Annie and I get paid by MAPS Public Benefit Corporation for this work. And we're on the Scientific Advisory Board of Awaken Life Sciences, which is a for-profit in England that's just starting up to try to do trainings and have clinics over there for treating addictions. And then just to remind everybody that MDMA is still an investigational drug. We're talking about investigational use, and that it certainly has risks as well as possible benefits. And so I want to really express my gratitude for all the people that make this happen. And, I think that the research itself is very exciting, but I'm also really excited about this drug development model. The fact that we're doing this in a nonprofit drug development model, which is quite unusual. And so this is a picture from a couple of years ago, and MAPS Public Benefit Corporation has now grown to be over 100 people, and it's still growing because we're so busy with the research. So it takes, and it's all been supported by private donors mostly, and some small foundations. No government money, no industry money, and a lot of really talented, passionate, very smart and well-educated people working really hard to make this possible. And so this is how the model works. MAPS is a 501c3 nonprofit. And when some few years ago, as part of the research strategy, they spun off the Public Benefit Corporation. So now actually the Public Benefit Corporation runs the research, and they borrow the money from MAPS for that. But there's only one shareholder for the Public Benefit Corporation, that's the nonprofit. So when MDMA is approved, if the benefit corporation makes some money from selling MDMA, all the proceeds, all the profits will go back into the nonprofit mission. No individual will make any money from MDMA being approved. There are no shareholders other than the nonprofit. So that feels really good to me too. So I want to give you a little bit of background. I know, as I understand it, there's a really wide range of how much background you all have already. So I'm going to try to cover some of the basic points along the way too. So we'll talk a little bit about the background, about the clinical trials, about our therapeutic approach, something a little bit about the possible mechanisms, and then just some reflections on it, and show you, I'll read some quotes and show you about a 10-minute video clip so you can get a feel for what the sessions are like. Just a little bit of MDMA history. It was first synthesized and patented, synthesized by Merck in 1912, patented in 1914. So it's been off patent for a long time, which is one of the reasons it's nonprofit research. And also, just a word about that, you're probably aware that there are a lot of for-profit companies coming into this space and trying to patent stuff. MAPS actually, a long time ago, hired a patent attorney to have an anti-patent strategy to put everything in the public domain to prevent MAPS or any of us or anyone from getting a patent or use patent on how to use it. So we really are making a big effort to keep this in the nonprofit public benefit realm. So it kind of lay dormant. Merck didn't do anything with it. And then the military did some experimentation at one point. But then right up the road from you, Alexander Sasha Shulgin, a chemist who had worked for Dow Pharmaceutical before, was interested in psychedelics, and he synthesized it and tried it himself. And he thought it seemed like something that could be useful for therapy. So he gave some to his friend Leo Zeff, a retired therapist, and Leo Zeff came out of retirement to start using it in conjunction with therapy, and taught a lot of other psychiatrists and therapists to do that too. So there was a significant, relatively small compared to all the therapists, but there were several thousand people using MDMA in association with psychotherapy before it was illegal. It wasn't an approved drug, but it wasn't illegal either. And then there were a number of reports about that. They're all mentioned. But then in 1985, the DEA put it in Schedule 1, and it became very difficult to do research. So all the research stopped for quite a while. And of course, non-medical and research use went up steadily after that. So, but Rick Doblin was watching. And has Rick already spoken to you, or is he going to speak? Anyway, Rick Doblin, who wanted to be a psychedelic psychotherapist, but realized in order to do that, he had to make MDMA. He wanted to be an MDMA therapist, but he had to, instead of going to graduate school for psychology, he decided he'd better go to Kennedy School at Harvard and learn to make MDMA legal. So he's been doing that ever since. So here's some of the reports that were published, very reputable people, psychiatrists and psychologists from UCLA and Harvard, who testified, had published reports of using MDMA with therapy, and they actually testified at the FDA, at the DEA hearings. So there was reason to think it could be useful, but there were no controlled trials done at that time. So that's what we've been doing. So I want to, before I tell you more about the research, I want to give you a little context about how Annie and I got involved, and because it's about how we view this medicine as a tool, and how we think about this whole thing, which goes beyond the drugs to the larger topic of shifting consciousness, using various technologies for shifting consciousness. So I practiced emergency medicine for 10 years, and starting in 81. But then after not quite 10 years of that, I was really just wanting to do something else with my medical license. I enjoyed the ER for a long time, but I was getting much more curious about, the psychological forces that were bringing people to the ER, and also just, my own curiosity about my own consciousness and the nature of consciousness. So as I was looking around for ideas about a shift in my career, I came across a little article about Stanislav Grof. And I'm sure a lot of you know, but Stan Grof was one of the leading LSD researchers back in the day, when that was legal, first in what was then Czechoslovakia and Prague, and then later at Johns Hopkins. And then later he went to Esalen. So I read this article about Stan's work, and it sounded fascinating. So I went to the library at the medical school in Charleston, South Carolina, to see if they had any of his books. And they did have this book, Beyond the Brain. No one had ever taken it out before, because those were the days when they had the little stamps in the back, and there were no stamps. So apparently I was the first person to take it out of the medical school library. And it had a huge impact on me. For one thing, the power to explain some of my own psychedelic experiences from when I was in college in the 60s was very striking. So basically, but Stan's point was that, when he started using LSD and taking it himself and getting curious about it, and this was pure LSD sent by Sandoz to these different universities. Stan very quickly realized that this was not just some kind of drug delirium or something, that these were meaningful experiences. So he basically realized over time that even though this was new to modern psychiatry, these states of consciousness that people were having with LSD were not new. Other cultures had described them for hundreds of years. And this whole idea of what Stan calls the healing potential of non-ordinary states of consciousness was what kind of he realized was happening. So it was not just about giving people drugs. It was about the drugs catalyzing a shift in consciousness that was very useful for healing and growth. And other cultures had known that, but now Stan was one of the people kind of bringing it to awareness about possible use of these compounds. So I decided to apply for psychiatry residency and apply for the Groff training that Stan was doing in modules out in California. So I did those simultaneously. So I really went into psychiatry in all those years ago, specifically because I was interested in this whole idea of shifting consciousness in a way that was useful for healing and growth. So I think, we talk a lot about the drugs, and obviously the drugs are very useful tools, or the medicines. I like calling the medicines in a way better. But remembering that it's not just about the medicines, it's about the process that the medicines are catalysts for. So I guess I'm inclined to stop and see if anybody has any questions about that before we go on so far. Okay. So a little bit about the clinical trials. Let's see. First, I thought I had sorry, I got confused. Anyway, they're basically in the FDA drug development, there are different phases of research. And over the years that MDMA was used recreationally, a lot of governments did the basic science preclinical research that had already been done. And then the first clinical research is phase 1, where you give a drug to healthy volunteers. And Charlie Grove down in UCLA was the first person who did the first phase 1 study in the US, or the first one in the world with MDMA. And then there was a couple others in the US before we started. And then we started at phase 2, which is when you give a drug to people with a diagnosis to test safety in that population, to test treatment effects. Most of our clinical trials in phase 2 and the only ones in phase 3 have been focused on PTSD, although we're checking out some other indications too. And part of the reason is the burden of post-traumatic stress disorder is huge in the world. This is how many people every year, 8 million in the US, 350 million at least worldwide. And it's been recognized in recent years that even though there was a lot of attempt to treat PTSD with drugs, Zoloft and Paxil are the two approved, they helped with some of the symptoms, but it became clear that therapy, not pharmacology, was the primary treatment for PTSD, and including the statement from the VA recognized that. So basically, if psychotherapy is a definitive treatment, that's good to know, but it doesn't work for a lot of people. At least half the people do not respond adequately to current treatments. So basically what we're asking is, what about a drug that could catalyze the psychotherapy? So it's much different from most drug trials in that the drug is used as only a few times as a catalyst. This is MDMA. I'm not going to spend too much time on the chemistry. It's often called a psychedelic. I think that's a good term since psychedelic means mind manifesting, but it is quite different from classic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin in that there's overlap for sure, but it tends to cause less confusion or less, MDMA doesn't tend to cause hallucinations, and it's less disorienting. So a little bit gentler in some ways in that respect. And the term entactogen has been suggested for this class of drugs like MDMA, meaning to touch within, kind of referring to the fact that MDMA tends to give people a sense of more connection with their own inner experience as well as other people, with more empathy and often a sense of well-being and insightfulness. But the well-being is definitely relative. People, especially with PTSD, may have a sense of loss of control, and it may be pretty challenging, even if less so in some ways than classic psychedelics. MDMA has a really complex pharmacology. I'm sure you're learning about that. A lot of it is about serotonin release and release of other monoamines, norepinephrine and dopamine. It also enhances the release of several hormones, including oxytocin and prolactin, which have interesting psychological effects. So there's a lot happening in the neurochemistry. So here's where we are now. This is what's been happening with phase 2. So we applied to get our first study approved in October 1st of 2001. We actually got FDA approval in 30 days for that first study. But then it took a few more years to get DEA and IRB approval. That's a long, complicated story. There's a lot of twists and turns. But we did get approval, and we started the first study a couple months later in April of 2004. And then as you heard before, we finished that one in 2009. It actually took quite a while to recruit everybody. But then as of 2016, MAPS had finished 6 phase 2 trials had been completed, which brought us to a meeting with FDA, end of phase 2 meeting in the summer of 2017. And we not only got permission to move forward into phase 3 trials, but we got breakthrough therapy designation, which means it's a program under FDA that means that if your phase 2 data is promising enough for a serious illness, that it looks promising that it may be a treatment that's much better than what exists, then they give it breakthrough therapy designation to try to expedite the process through the FDA. So that was a very good sign. You still have to go through the whole process, but it gives you a little faster timeline. So when 5 of us went to that. Usually the big pharma companies send 25 or 30 people to these meetings, but we're kind of a small, lean team. So we were very pleased at the way that meeting went. Like 1 second after this picture, we got chased off by police because you're not supposed to take pictures in front of the FDA apparently, but we escaped. These are the 6 studies that were done. Annie and I did 2 of them in Charleston. First one with people with mostly rape or childhood sexual abuse, and the second one with veterans and first responders. And then there were studies in Switzerland, Vancouver, Israel, and Boulder with mixed populations of people with PTSD. And those we've published on some more than 1 paper, but we published papers on 4 of those studies. So I'm not going to give you all the details. You can read them. I think we sent some as a reading list. But these are some of the papers. So those are the top 3 are the ones we did. And the top 3 papers are about the 2 of the studies we did in Charleston. And you see after the first study, we had a really long-term follow-up, 42 months. And those are the papers from the other studies. So we, in 2000, well, in 2000, it was actually beginning of 2019, this was published. This was the pooled results of all those 6 studies. So we published several of them beforehand, and then we published the pooled results. And we had a very, we had a large effect size of 0.8 after 2 sessions of MDMA and 0.9 after 3. And then that was subtracting the effect of the therapy by itself, because the people that got placebo got all the same therapy and had significant improvement with just the therapy. So the overall effect of the treatment was even larger, but it was large effect compared to the therapy alone. That's just a graph. The top line is it was either inactive placebo with therapy or low dose comparator of MDMA. It's kind of an active placebo. So you can see there was some improvement. This is the clinician administered PTSD scores, which is kind of the gold standard for PTSD research. It's the measure that the FDA accepted for approving Paxil and Zoloft for PTSD. So we had a really robust response in the group that got the MDMA with the therapy. We also, in a couple of the phase 2 trials, because there was question about could MDMA cause memory loss or other neuropsychological problems, there was some data with recreational use that, was controversial, but raised some concerns. So we did formal neuropsychological testing before and after. I'm going to show you the first one, which is the R bands, the most comprehensive one, but the results were similar for the other tests we used. And this was from our first study and the study in Boulder, pooled results. And you can see the darker green is before any treatment, and the light green is after 2 MDMA sessions. So you can see there was no, regardless of from 0 milligrams to 125 milligrams, no evidence of any neuropsychological problems. And as we've seen repeatedly in different studies, not only were the results durable, we at the end of the original study, we checked the CAPS results in most studies at 2 months, sometimes at 1 month. But then when we did follow up at least 12 months later, in some cases it was 3.5 years later, we found actually not only a few people had relapsed, so it doesn't last for everybody, but overall, on average, there had been continued improvement afterwards, which kind of really fits with the idea that this is a catalyst for a psychotherapeutic process that keeps unfolding. And so there's the numbers. That's the baseline CAPS, 2 month, and this was actually from the first study when it was 3.5 years later. So it's very encouraging that it lasts so well for most people. I'm gonna go ahead a little faster. And of course, it's important to remember we do careful medical and psychological screening. So the safety is in the setting of carefully screened people without serious underlying medical disease and ruling out some psychological problems. So people had to have at least moderately severe PTSD. In all the phase 2 trials, they had to have failed prior therapy. They don't have to have failed prior therapy in phase 3. And we did exclude some psychiatric disorders, but we included people with other anxiety disorders or depression, things like that. Again, you can read the details in the paper, so I'm going to kind of keep moving. This is a reminder that, like anything else, MDMA has side effects. These are the most common ones we saw in our phase 3 trial. And of course, MDMA can be dangerous for people with underlying diseases or in the wrong setting. There have been fatalities in recreational settings, usually from overheating or dehydration, or a few times from overhydration and cerebral edema, brain swelling. But we haven't had any fatalities or that kind of problem in clinical trials. So our phase 3 research, that was phase 2 that we finished. We're now in phase 3. We have 11 sites in US, 2 in Israel, and 2 in Canada. And we just finished the first phase 3 trial in all those sites, and now they've started the second phase 3 trial. We also have expanded access, which is like compassionate use, where you can start giving it to some people under a treatment protocol before you finish phase 3. So that's been approved in the US and Israel, hasn't started yet. And Canada just passed a new law about that, so it should be happening in Canada soon. And we're starting to enroll people in studies in Europe. The first 2 to start were Czech Republic and the Netherlands. Others are coming along. We probably about a year behind the US, but we're expecting to have 7 sites running in Europe pretty soon. So we're hoping that the Europe approval will come about a year after US if everything goes well. So our agreement with FDA is we have to do 2 phase 3 trials to apply for MDMA to be approved. The first one is finished. They were each supposed to be 100, but because of COVID, when the restrictions came, we had enrolled all 100, but we'd only treated 90. So the FDA agreed we could stop at 90 because it didn't make sense to proceed with those people that were kind of in the middle of all these changes. Now we're operating the second phase 2 under, careful COVID kind of precautions, and it's going more slowly, but it is going. So what we're projecting possibly is if all goes well, we could finish the second study in sometime in 2022, and then perhaps receive FDA approval, if again, depending on the results. But we expect by 2023, we could apply for a new drug application and see what the FDA says. We do think that there will be some requirements for risk evaluation and mitigation afterwards, that it will probably be required that it's only administered in certified clinics by trained providers, no take-home doses, and probably be shipped directly from the manufacturer to the clinics. So, I realized, I apologize, I was rearranging slides a little while ago. I seem to have left out the slide about the study design, but I want to make the point that, MDMA is only administered 3 times in these protocols, a month apart, and preceded by preparation sessions, 3 90-minute sessions for preparation. And then after each MDMA session, which are 8-hour sessions with 2 therapists, then there are a lot of attention to careful follow-up sessions to help people integrate the experience. And both of those are really important. It's not just about what happens in the MDMA session. It's really important to have good support for integration afterwards. So, as you can see, we didn't come up with this idea of using MDMA for therapy, and we didn't come up with the basic approach we used. We learned a lot of it from Stan Grof and many others. And basically what we learned from the pioneers in psychedelic research and kind of combined that with our own training and experience in working with PTSD. And so we've got it described in our treatment manual, which you can download free of charge on the MAPS website. This is where we do the sessions. This is our office in Charleston, which we're not at anymore, but the research is going on there. So we have a futon, as you can see. People can either sit up against pillows against the wall or lie down. And we take a relatively non-directive approach is the idea, really what we learn from Stan Groff and our other teachers. We sometimes call it non-directed, but self-directed is a better term, that it's directed by the participant's own inner healing intelligence is the idea. And the therapists are there to support what's naturally unfolding, but not to direct it. But it doesn't mean the therapists never give any direction. It just means it's always in service of whatever is happening already, rather than trying to determine the direction ahead of time. People spend part of the time reclining. If they're comfortable with high shades and listening to music, that can be helpful to focus inward. That's optional. Some people aren't comfortable with that. And, we encourage people to alternate periods of focusing inward with periods of focusing with talking to the therapist. There's no set schedule for that. We think, it's good to have both. It's usually about half and half, but again, it's quite flexible according to the person's own process. And the term we learned from Stan Groff was inner healing intelligence, the idea that if you can help, have tools for helping people shift consciousness into a more, what he calls holotropic state of consciousness, oriented toward wholeness, then they have access to their own natural healing intelligence. And that's what can guide the process better than some agenda that the therapist or the participant have. And we've seen that play out again and again. In some ways it sounds kind of woo-woo, I guess, to scientists, but actually, if you think about it, it's a little bit like immunotherapy for cancer. It's an idea of having a drug that can help access and support the natural healing abilities that the individual has. And again, a lot of importance placed on preparation and integration. And what we notice when we take this non-directive approach is we see elements of other therapies come up spontaneously. I'm not going to have time to go into the details of this. I've written some about it in the MAPS bulletin, which you can find online too. But it's very interesting that by taking this approach, it doesn't mean that nothing happens similar to things that happen in more directive therapies, but we think it's a real advantage that they happen in different combinations and in different orders for different people. So, people are likely to process the trauma at times, but they're likely to have, psychodynamic kind of work about relationships and early life and all these other factors. It seems to be a really good way to support people accessing whichever of these they need to access themselves. And so it's like, I've always liked this quote from Irvin Yalom, a well-known professor emeritus at Stanford. The idea that therapists must strive to create a new therapy for each person. It has to be individualized. And I've always liked that. And we take it maybe one step further, or maybe the therapist must strive to allow and encourage each patient to create a new therapy for themselves. So that's kind of what our self-directed approach is aimed at. And I made this slide when we did a training in the Netherlands a few years ago. It occurred to me, it's kind of like curling. You set something in motion, but then you don't mess with it. You don't push it around afterwards. You may remove some obstacles and help guide it slightly, but you don't interfere with its own momentum. And of course, to do this, to sit with people for 8 hours and be present and support in that way without being too intrusive, but also being really present and available, that takes, some kind of presence from the therapist, which points out the importance of us doing our own inner work and our own self-care to allow us to be present in those intense states. And, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the theories about how this might be working, but I really want to emphasize that I don't want to be reductionistic about trying to explain this, because it's such what we're seeing is such a rich and complex process that I think these medicines have a lot to teach us about the nature of human healing, that we don't want to miss learning because we're focused on trying to explain it according to our pre-existing theories. So it's great to learn more about the science. We'll continue to do that, but it's also important not to be reductionistic, I think. We're reductionist thinking. So why does this help? We don't know. We've mainly been studying whether it works or whether it's safe, and we're finding good results on those. But many people are looking into the underlying science, and going to not spend much time on this, but there are lots of really interesting and exciting ideas. There's evidence that MDMA promotes fear extinction. That was published recently from Emory. And it may be partly about memory reconsolidation, that a memory comes up that's traumatic and then it gets reconsolidated with new associations to safety and to being okay. There's really interesting stuff about increasing neuroplasticity that seems to hold true for a number of these drugs. And this recent work showing that it may be opening a social reward learning circuit that gets closed when you're young, but can be opened up again, so you have a chance to have new social reward learning. And this was kind of a cool study. Gil Dolan got some MDMA from MAPS and did a research with an experiment with octopi. And apparently octopi are very solitary except during mating season, or if you give them MDMA, then they come out of their little places and they interact with each other. So I'm going to just mention a couple things about the neuroscience that seem to fit particularly well with what we observe clinically. We know that people with PTSD have decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex and in hippocampus, and increased activity in amygdala, which kind of makes sense. Amygdala is the fear center. It's one way to say it. So more activity in fear centers and less activity in higher processing and less connection with what you've learned since the trauma. That's people with PTSD. Here's people with taking MDMA. It actually decreases activity in amygdala and increases activity in prefrontal cortex. So it makes sense that might be helpful. And it fits so well with what we notice in the sessions that people, people have written about this phenomenon with other kinds of therapy, this idea of the window of tolerance or the optimal arousal zone. If arousal is on the vertical axis, the idea is that if you're trying to do therapeutic work with trauma or with something that's bothering you, if you get hyper aroused and you're overwhelmed by anxiety, you can't really process effectively. Conversely, if you're too emotionally cut off and numb, which also happens with PTSD, you can't really process effectively. But there's this sweet spot in the middle where therapeutic change can happen. And we think one way of understanding MDMA is it gives people a number of hours in that optimal arousal zone where they can process the trauma in a way that they hadn't been able to before. The other area that's very complex and not going to go into much, but is that what's being learned about the way that neural networks are changing in their relation to each other, especially the default mode network. So this is from Robin Carr at Harrison in London, although he's been recruited to UCSF. So I'm not sure when he's moving, but anyway, they've done a lot of really interesting work with this. And Robin has this theory about relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. The idea that, especially if you've got PTSD, but to some degree to all of us, we have a lot of influence from prior beliefs from our cortex that tend to block information from below or take precedence over what we're getting from our emotional centers or from outside. So the idea is if these prior beliefs get relaxed, then it gives a chance for a different experience. So one analogy that one of the researchers in Robin's lab, Mendel Kaelin, has used is it's as if you've been sledding down a hill or going down a track in the snow, and you can't, after a while, you can't turn out of that track. There's only one way you can go. And this effect of those on those neural networks is kind of like new fallen snow, that somehow you have suddenly you have a chance for a different response. And that's very consistent with what we see in the sessions of people. They're really stuck with these prior beliefs of like the world is dangerous or worthless. And suddenly they have some freedom from that and can respond differently. And there's also the pro-social effects, which have something to do with oxytocin and serotonin. And that can really help with augmenting the therapeutic alliance and helping people have a corrective attachment experience if they've had attachment injury when they're young. So a few quotes from study participants to illustrate some of this. This is an important one. A number of people said things like either exactly this or things like this. I don't know why they call this ecstasy. So this is making the point that, you know, it's not just that people get blissed out and everything's fine and that's the end of the story. Processing trauma is challenging and painful, usually with or without MDMA. So MDMA seems to often make it possible for people to do it when they hadn't been able to before, but it doesn't mean it's a cakewalk. It still can be really painful and challenging, which is part of the reason for the preparation and the support during the 8 hours and the integration sessions afterwards. This is a good description of kind of fits very well with what we were seeing about the neuroscience. People told us, you can read it, people told us that often it changed their emotions, their relationships, their emotions, that when they're suddenly, or, you know, for the first time in years, able to be with painful emotions without being overwhelmed and actually just work with them effectively. Once that happens with MDMA, people very often felt, okay, I can probably do this without MDMA now too. And usually that was the case. This is a good one from one of the veterans. I'll let you read it. So I think you can see that sounds like a pretty good thing if you're doing psychotherapy, to not skip the stuff in the attic. And then people often have transpersonal or spiritual experiences. This is talking about when his mind thoughts stopped and finally was just in the present moment. And this is referring to what I was saying about it's not just what happens during the MDMA sessions. And we really try to emphasize that for people. And this is a veteran who really is reporting that that was his experience, especially as he, after a couple sessions, he realized how much happens after the sessions and how valuable that was. So I'm going to show you a video of about a 10-minute video clip of a veteran who's graciously allowed me to use his video clips. If I don't know if some of you may have heard of the book Acid Test by Tom Schroeder. Nick is the veteran in that book, which is one reason I can use his name. He's allowed Tom Schroeder, who wrote the book, to watch all his videos from all his sessions. So you can read more detail about him if you want. He had a high CAP score at the beginning, and obviously it really went down. He did very well. So I'm going to stop sharing that. Yeah, I guess we might as well just go with the video now and then have discussion afterwards. So it's about 10 minutes. And I want to ask you, I know there's going to be this is going to be available to watch the video for people afterwards. But I'm going to ask you, out of respect for Nick, not to like video your screen or save it yourself in any way. Okay, cool.
Stop the live stream. Michael,
Yep. What?
you want me to pause the live stream as well?
I'm sorry. What'd you say?
Do you want me to pause the YouTube live stream as well?
Oh, to keep it out of the YouTube thing?
Yeah. Would you like
That
me
would actually, if that works, that would probably be better.
Yeah. Yeah. We should